Hi, it's Summer, and these are my favorite books that I read this year. I read 101 books this year, which is the most I've ever read. I think I read around 80 last year, and at the time that was the most I had ever read. So this is like a huge accomplishment for me. I'm very proud of myself. But also, since I read so many books, I have a lot of favorites. And I also have a few graphic novels that I'm gonna kind of throw in at the end as kind of like honorable mentions. And I'm also going to save my favorite book for last. My first book on this list is Garden Spells by Sarah Addison Allen. This one is cozy fantasy, and that's definitely a theme throughout a lot of these books on this list. At the beginning of 2023, I thought that I was going to be in my dark academia era, but it turns out I was in my cozy fantasy era, and I just want to stay here forever. I love cozy fantasy. I think that I found my niche. And yeah, this was one of them that I read and loved. This book has major practical magic vibes. It's about sisters. One of the sisters comes home after being gone for a long time. It says they have always been a curious family endowed with peculiar gifts that make them outsiders in their town. The town that they're in has a lot of quirky, funny characters that these sisters are close to. There's also some romance that goes on. There's an apple tree in their backyard that's kind of like animated a little bit. It has personality, and the apples on it are kind of magic. I feel like all of that is just kind of like scratching the surface of this story, but it's so heartwarming and whimsical. But if you like the movie adaptation of Practical Magic, you 100% need to read this one. Next up, I have Fourth Wing. And listen, I know that this book and the series is flawed, it's not perfect, but this had so much hype around it, and I really felt like it lived up to the hype. I love romantasy, and it's really hard to find one that gives you the same feelings as Throne of Glass or A Court of Thorns and Roses, and this felt pretty dang close. I loved the dragons and the magic system. I loved the characters and the friendships. The romance was very fun and spicy. It was a good time. And I just had a really fun time with it. And we also read it for my in-person book club. And so it was really fun to like discuss the book with everyone. So I think that reading experience also kind of helped bump this up. It was also just really fun to see people who had never given fantasy a chance fall in love with fantasy because of this book. Next, I have Cackle by Rachel Harrison. This was my first book from Rachel Harrison, and I loved it. I'm kind of finding out that Rachel Harrison writes cozy horror, at least some of the time at least. This book is definitely cozy horror. It's about this woman who starts a job in this small town, and as she's going around getting to know the locals and stuff, she meets this really strange woman who all of the other residents of this town kind of act strangely towards. This mysterious woman is named Sophie. She seems to never age. She has this incredible mansion. She also might kind of like have powers. And it's kind of like a toxic friendship, but they also like really care for each other. It's a really interesting dynamic to follow. And it just kind of like wasn't what I was expecting. I don't even really know what I was expecting going into it, but it's just a different fun take on a witchy book. Next up, I have Rules for Visiting by Jessica Frances Kane. Can we also just take a minute to admire this cover? It's so pretty. It's one of my all-time favorites. And I just love it when the outside of a book is just as good as the inside, because this book was so good. I think this would be classified as literary fiction. This one follows the main character, May, who is like some kind of botanist or like landscape specialist at her local university. Through some kind of contest at work, she wins a bunch of time off, and she decides that with this time off, she's going to go and visit 4 of her old friends that she's kind of like lost connection with over the years. Also through the years, because of her history and growing up and trauma, she's really become kind of a recluse, and she's happy just being by herself with her plants. There's a lot of plant things in this book, lots of imagery, lots of facts. So as a person who loves plants, I thought that was kind of a fun, cool thing to be reading about in a book. May also really loves language, so there's a lot in this book about what words mean, where they came from, that kind of a thing, and I really enjoyed that aspect of this book as well. Throughout the book, as she's visiting her friends, she's kind of like telling us the rules for visiting, like how to be a good guest. There are some friendship interactions that are more awkward than others. You just get to see some really beautiful friendship relationships. And through her visiting her friends and getting that support from them, she's able to let herself live again. And she's able to work through some of her trauma because she has that support system. I really heavily related to this book with those themes especially. I've really heavily relied on my friendships over the last couple of years, and they mean so much to me. And so I just loved that this book made me feel so much. Next, I have The Winter People by Jennifer McMahon. I think I read this one all the way back in January, and I still think about it all the time. This one is really hard to explain. There's a lot of different characters and timelines that we're following. There's current day. I think there's 2 daughters that live with their mom, and their mom goes missing. And I think current day there's also another woman that ends up kind of getting involved in the story. And then also there's a character set back in like the 1800s or something, and we get to read her perspective through journals that she has left. And it's basically about all of these people living in this certain area in this certain home and really creepy, horrific things that are happening. This book will scare you. It will make you feel cold. It was just such a creepy fun time. Next up I have In the Weeds by B.K. Borison. This one is the sequel to Love Light Farms, and it follows Beckett and Evelyn, I think. Beckett is one of the people that works on or at Love Light Farms, and Evelyn is also a character from the first book. Evelyn is kind of sick of her fast-paced life as a social media influencer. She's really down to earth, and she feels like the last time she was really able to just be herself and relax was when she was visiting Love Light Farms. So she decides that she's going to go and stay there for a little bit. Her and Beckett already know each other from the first book, but also from before the events that happened in the first book. They had like a one-night stand, and so it's kind of like a second chance romance. I really liked the romance. I loved the small town vibes. I really love this series and B.K. Borison's writing. Love Light Farms was one of my favorite books last year, and I'm just really excited to read the next 2 books in the series. Next, I have Heartstopper Volume 5. I don't have my copy in person because I'm letting my friend Rachel borrow it. I got her hooked, and I'm so glad. I don't even know what I can say at this point about Heartstopper that I haven't already like a million times. I love Heartstopper so much, both the graphic novels and the TV show. It's just so sweet and wholesome. Looking back, Heartstopper is really like one of the main things that helped me realize my own sexuality, because I just related so much to Nick and I couldn't figure out like why. And then I was like, oh, it's just so special to me because I love the character so much, but also just it did a lot for me being able to like realize my own identity. So that's a review of like the series as a whole, but this book specifically, I just loved the topics that were talked about. I just love the character development that's been happening through the series. I also really liked the conversations about sex that were in this one. I thought they were really healthy conversations. As someone who didn't really get very much growing up as far as sex ed, I wish that my experience would have been closer to what these characters had. Anyway, I love Heartstopper. I'll never shut up about it. And if you haven't read the series yet, you just absolutely have to, or at least just watch the TV show on Netflix because it's so good. Next, I have Revelator by Daryl Gregory. This is another just like stunning cover. I'm obsessed with this, even though it's like kind of creepy. I love it. This is Southern Gothic historical fiction, and it's also paranormal horror. I usually am not a fan of historical fiction unless it has some kind of horror or fantasy element. So this one was perfect. This is one of the weirdest books I have ever read, and it was so creepy and so fun. Listening to this book on audio was like having an A24 movie playing in my head. It absolutely needs to be turned into an A24 movie. It would be perfect. It's multiple timelines set in the South. It's kind of taking place during the Prohibition. There's kind of like some religious cult activity going on. If you like weird horror, you need to give this one a try. After that, I have Lost in the Moment and Found by Shauna McGuire. This is book number 8 in the Wayward Children series. I love this series. The last few books haven't been my favorite. I've been really wanting something that would give me the same feelings as the first couple of books, and also In an Absent Dream, because that one's I think my favorite out of the series so far. This one is the first one in a while that has given me those same feelings as the first couple of books. This one follows the main character, who's a little girl. I think her name is Ancy, short for Antoinette. This whole series is portal fantasy, so there's a lot to do with like doors leading to other places. So Ancy goes through this door and she finds this shop of lost things. So anything that's ever been lost can be found in this store. She leaves a really terrible situation at home. It was really hard to read about, but she ends up staying in this nexus of the lost things. So this book is really different from the other ones because the other ones are mostly just like you go through one door and you go to one other place. But she's living in this nexus, so there's doors that open up at any given time to like random places. So we get to see a ton of different places, which was really fun. This one also has really interesting characters. This one kind of felt sad and a lot heavier than the other books in the series, but I felt like it gave it a lot of depth. And the same as all the other books, I loved the writing style. All right, next I have another cozy fantasy, and that is Assistant to the Villain by Hannah Nicole Mayer. This was a silly, goofy, cute time. And one of the Goodreads reviews that I read for this one said that it's idiots to lovers. And that is so accurate. This follows the main character, Evie, who is really needing a job. She ends up running into her town's most infamous villain, and he offers her a job. So every day she goes to his manor house, and she's doing assistant work. Like she's at her desk doing paperwork or something, and then he's like torturing someone in the next room. Like it's just ridiculous and funny. Like you definitely have to read this one and just not take it too seriously. It's Grumpy Sunshine. There are dragons and other magical creatures. There's a frog named Kingsley who can communicate with people by holding up signs that say things on them. This was just fun. I had such a fun time reading it that I actually just like read it again. I read this 2 times in the same month. Also, this doesn't have a ton of romance in it. It's kind of more of like a slow burn. I'm really excited for the next book to see where that goes. Another beautiful cover. This is The God of Endings by Jacqueline Holland. If you mixed together The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, The Wishing Game, and House of Hunger, you would get this book. This one is set during the 80s and it follows Colette. She's a lonely artist who heads an elite fine art school for children in upstate New York. So we follow that timeline set in the 80s, but we also get to see basically her entire life leading up to that. She's a vampire, so she's lived a really long time. So you get to see a little bit of her life before she was turned, and then a bunch of time after. You just get to see everything that she's gone through, the ups and the downs. You really get to know her as a person because you get to spend so much time with her. The current day perspective in the 80s, she has a special connection with one of the boys in her art class, and she kind of gets wrapped up in his family and his home life. There's also some kind of like strange things that are starting to happen to her. I really loved the writing and how this one felt like a slow burn, very gothic. I loved her relationship with this boy in her class. I loved hearing about her life and her found family, and also everything to do with The God of Endings is very interesting. Next is Astrid Parker Doesn't Fail by Ashley Herring Blake. This series is an all-time favorite. I love this series so much. This is the second book and it's definitely my favorite. I would say that I definitely relate to Astrid the most out of all of the characters. This one is about Astrid, who's an interior decorator, and a year ago she broke up with her fiance. She's been super hyper focused on her job and she gets an opportunity to design for like a home renovation TV show, kind of like HGTV. She's going to be helping with the renovation of a local inn. The carpenter that's going to be working with her on this project is named Jordan, and the inn that they're renovating is actually, it belongs to her family, it belongs to her grandma, and she does not like what Astrid has planned for the renovation. So they kind of butt heads with that, but they also, on top of that, did not get off to a good start even before the renovation stuff. So it's enemies to lovers, which is always a favorite. Also, the dedication alone made me love this book. I think it was something along the lines of to everyone who figured it out a little later in life, because the book is kind of about Astrid coming to terms with her sexuality and being bisexual, and she's figuring that out later in her life, like in her 20s/30s. I don't remember how old she is, but I really related to that. I loved the romance, the character development, the found family. I love anything that's kind of like HGTV, home renovation, decorating vibes. It had awesome queer representation in it. It was deep, but also fun and steamy. I just really loved it. I just related to the book so much. I related to Astrid so much. This one is The Wishing Game by Meg Schaefer. This one is about Lucy, who's a teacher's aide, and she has a special connection with one of the kids in her class. It's a little boy named Christopher who's an orphan, and she wants nothing more than to be able to adopt him. She's been sharing her favorite books from her childhood called the Clock Island series with Christopher. It's something that they've bonded over and they both love. Lucy doesn't have enough money to be able to start the adoption process for Christopher, and one day the author of the Clock Island series, who has been in a hiding for years, announces that he has a new book that he's just written, and he's going to be hosting a contest where he invites people to come to the island that he lives on called Clock Island. It's very much inspired by the book series. And whoever wins this contest that he's hosting will win the manuscript, and they can do whatever they want with it. She's one of a few people that get invited to participate in this contest, and she's trying to win the manuscript so that she can sell it and have enough money to adopt Christopher. This one is about a book within a book, which is my favorite thing. I loved all of the relationships in this book, especially the platonic relationships. All of the characters in this felt real to me, and I just wanted to hug all of them. This book made me cry. It's just so heartwarming. It's sad, but it's also hopeful. I also loved the setting of Clock Island. It's so whimsical. I want to live there. There's also a little bit of a romance in this one that I really liked as well. Next I have House of Hunger by Alexis Henderson. My favorite way to advertise this to people is lesbian vampires. The vibes are amazing. This is kind of like an alternate history kind of fantasy book. The main character is super poor and she really needs money, so she decides to sign a contract to become a blood maid. The really wealthy and higher up people in this society believe that drinking the blood of young women has healing properties and will keep them younger and stuff. So young women sign up to let people drink their blood, and in exchange they have a place to stay, and they also get a really nice retirement when they're done. So the main character gets assigned to this household that has a few other blood maids, and you get to see her interact with them and also with the woman who has hired them. It's very sexy but also creepy. It kind of feels like a thriller. I thought that the direction that it went in was really cool. This was just really different, and I love a vampire book, so this one was just a really fun time. Next, I have another cozy fantasy. This is Half a Soul by Olivia Atwater. This one is Regency era with Fae, and it has a grumpy romance, which I had never read before, I don't think, and it is my favorite thing ever. The main character, Dora, was cursed by a fairy when she was younger. The fairy took half of her soul. So according to all of the people around her, she acts differently, and the back says that it leaves her prone to accidental scandal. She's really blunt and just kind of speaks her mind and has no filter. It's very entertaining to read. She ends up going to London to participate in the London season to try to find a husband. She ends up meeting this guy, Elias or Elias. He is also very strange and not really accepted by society. They both have really similar personalities. They end up working together on some things. There's some mysteries that they're kind of trying to unravel. Lots of dangerous fairy things. This book was so good and it really surprised me. I went into it knowing almost nothing and I just had a great time. I loved this. I think about it all the time. Definitely a new all-time favorite. Next up, I have The House Across the Lake by Riley Sager. This one is so polarizing. So many of my friends absolutely hate this book, and I understand why. There are some certain things that happen in this one that you have to be a fan of to be able to enjoy it. I was obsessed though. I think the main character's name is Casey, and she's a recently widowed actress. And she's trying to escape a bunch of bad press that she's had lately. Her husband passed away not too long ago, and so she's grieving, and she's also kind of become an alcoholic. So she has retreated to her family's lake house. To pass her time there, she has a pair of binoculars, and she's been kind of watching the couple that lives in the house across the lake. She ends up befriending the wife that lives across the lake, and shortly after that, the wife goes missing. So Casey is trying to get to the bottom of this mystery. She's really suspicious of the husband. There are lots of secrets, and this is just such a good thriller. It's so creepy, and the plot twists blew my mind. This was everything that I wanted it to be. It really just went there. I also really liked the setting of being on the lake and like all of the creepy water scenes that we got. It was just so good, and I think this is my second favorite Riley Sager, Home Before Dark being my first favorite. We are now to my top 2 favorite books of the year. My second favorite book of the year. It's really high up there with my favorite book. I loved it. It's A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking by T. Kingfisher. This is cozy fantasy. I told you there's a theme. I read so many cozy fantasy books this year. This one follows a girl. I think she's either a preteen or a teenager. She's orphaned, but she lives with her aunt and uncle who own a bakery. This is a fantasy book and a fantasy world setting, and the magic in this world is kind of small and almost insignificant, and it's also oddly specific. So that was a really fun kind of quirky part of the story, was hearing about some of the random people and the ridiculous powers that they had. Like sometimes it's so specific that they can hardly even use the magic. The main character though has the ability to manipulate bread dough, so it's perfect that she works in a bakery. She can make it so that the bread doesn't burn. She animates the gingerbread men so that they can dance and walk around. And there's also an enchanted bucket of sourdough starter that lives in the basement. One day when this main character is opening up the bakery, there's a dead body on the ground and she gets blamed for the murder. All of this kind of sends her on this crazy adventure. She ends up making a friend that is trying to help her. This book actually got a little bit more political than I thought it would, but I actually really enjoyed it. I also just loved the ending of this book, the solutions that she was able to come up with. This book was just so great and heartwarming. It actually made me cry, which I was not expecting. I loved T. Kingfisher's writing. It was very quirky, but eloquent. Also just very blunt and kind of crude a little bit as far as like gross things that it kind of mentioned. Like there's definitely grit to this book. I loved it. If you want the same kind of vibes as Legends and Lattes, this is definitely it. That brings us to my favorite book of the year, which is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies by Heather Fawcett. I love this book so much. I think about it all the time. I read this book, Half a Soul, and a graphic novel that I'll talk about in a minute, all for my fairy reading vlog that I did back earlier this year in the spring. I loved everything that I read for that video so much. It was such a fun vlog, and I read so many favorite books during that. And then right after I finished filming that, I started A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking. So that week or 2 weeks of my life, I peaked and I just like can't top it. I read so many good books, and this one is my favorite out of all of them, even though those are also new all-time favorites. This one is historical fiction fantasy. This one follows Emily Wilde, who's a professor. She studies fairies and fairy folklore, and she's an expert in her field. She's working on an encyclopedia of fairies, and to finish this encyclopedia up, she is traveling to a small town. She's going to research the fairies there. When she gets there, she's having to kind of like interact with the people of the town. You get to see her interacting with the different fairies that live there. She's kind of solving some mysteries as well. One of her colleagues, Wendell Bamblebee, ends up kind of like dropping in on her project, and he ends up staying with her, and they end up kind of like working on a couple of things together. He's sunshine, she's grumpy. I really loved the small town vibes. The setting of this book was amazing. It's set during the winter, and it'll just make you feel cold but also cozy. I also loved reading about how they would go on these like little expeditions out in the snow to kind of explore the area a little bit. I loved meeting all of the people that lived in the small town, and also just seeing everyone's character development. Everyone changes quite a bit throughout the book, and you just love everyone by the end. Emily and Wendell, I am obsessed with them. Their banter is so good. Also, Emily has a dog named Shadow that goes with her everywhere, and I love Shadow. Also, just the writing style of this book was so good. It's kind of the same as A Wizard's Guide, where it's quirky and eloquent. I also really like how it's kind of told in journal entries. I feel like Heather Fawcett's ability to like start a chapter out with it sounding like a journal entry, and it's going to be recounting an event to us. It goes from that into being us experiencing it with the characters. I don't know if that makes sense, but I just think that she's a really talented author, and she just knows how to write. And I'm actually currently reading the sequel. I think it comes out in January. And so far I'm loving it just as much as this. Same vibes, same banter, I'm obsessed. I also just really quick wanted to mention a few graphic novels other than Heartstopper that I really loved this year. This one is The Sprite and the Gardener by Ria Brego and Joe Witt. This is the one that I also read for my fairy reading vlog. The illustrations are beautiful. This one is Aquacorn Cove by Kay O'Neill. Again, the art style is just stunning, and I also liked the themes of eco-consciousness in this one. This one is The Girl from the Sea by Molly Knox Ostertag. This one I think is also eco-conscious, and it's a queer coming-of-age middle grade. The Tea Dragon Society, also by Kay O'Neill. This is also queer, and I just love the world and the tea dragons. It's so creative and just cute. And then of course, Garlic and the Witch by Brie Paulson. This one is beautiful and cottagecore and witchy and magical. It's about magical vegetables. This is the sequel to Garlic and the Vampire. It's so cute, I love it. I also read another one on NetGalley called The Baker and the Bard. It's by Fern Hott. This one also just has really pretty illustrations. I think this one is also queer. It has a cute little adventure in it. It was just really cozy, and I loved all the fantasy elements. Those are all of my favorite books of the year. Let me know in the comments if we have any favorites in common. Let me know what your favorite book of the year is. Thank you so much for being here and for watching, and I will see you in the next one.
Appalachian sunrise.